can a trade war with China be won? U.S. President-elect Donald Trump vows to put America first, promising up to 60% tariffs on Chinese imports. So will we see a stronger U.S. economy at China's expense, or a lose-lose scenario to make the global economy suffer? I'm Andrea Sankin. Today's newsmaker is the U.S.-China relationship. Millions of American voters loved the promise of punishing China to bring jobs and prosperity back to the U.S. But many questioned if that's even possible, given U.S. manufacturing employment has been declining for decades. In some ways, cheaper Chinese products have boosted the U.S. retail sector and fueled more U.S. consumption. So if that equation changes, would the U.S. really come out ahead? And how will U.S. consumers respond to more expensive retail prices? Add to that geopolitical uncertainty over Taiwan, plus the so-called rise of the global south, and we really are entering some uncharted territory. Here's a look.
China-US relations are heading into uncertain times as Donald Trump prepares to return to the White House. The two global superpowers have had rocky relations in recent years, and they look set to get worse. During his first term, President Trump started a trade war with China, imposing high tariffs on many Chinese goods. And Beijing retaliated, placing its own tariffs against the US. The current US President Joe Biden kept those tariffs in place and even increased some of them to try to reduce the US dependence on China. Furthermore, tensions over Taiwan's future have only served to worsen the relationship. Last year, the US exported $148 billion worth of goods to China, while importing more than $500 billion. Now Trump is pledging to scrap China's favoured trading status and impose 60% or more tariffs on all Chinese goods. Trump's claims high tariffs would protect the domestic economy and generate huge tax revenue for his government.
The third most beautiful word is the word tariff. You know, it really did. Tariffs needed a press agent, because all these crooked politicians, they didn't like it. You know, they're all taken care of by foreign countries. They don't like tariffs. But we're doing the tariffs, and we're going to, I charged China. China was charged by me.
That would hit China's electric vehicle and solar industries, which are by far the largest in the world. Trump's policies could also put further pressure on China's semiconductor industry, as Washington has already implemented broad export controls over the transfer of key technologies. Yet Beijing says there will be no winner in a trade war and calls for sustainable relations.
It is hoped that the two sides will uphold the principles of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence and cooperation. Also win-win results, strengthening dialogue and communication to properly manage differences and expand mutually beneficial cooperation.
This all comes as China's economy is in trouble. The country suffers from slow growth, its real estate market is crashing, and local governments are in huge debt.
The economy is definitely not good. Now it's very difficult to make money. In Beijing, food, accommodation, all consumption is very expensive. Housing is all 2,000 or 3,000 yuan. Food, vegetables, everything is very expensive.
And the issue of Taiwan is not going away. Trump has said that if China were to invade Taiwan, he would impose additional tariffs. He also said Taiwan should pay for the US protection, as Washington provides billions of dollars of weapons to the island. Some believe Trump's America First policy could weaken Pacific alliances and create opportunities for Beijing.
Under the Trump administration, there would likely be an atrophy of the alliance system. So as you look at the various alliances such as NATO, at least those may be weakened a bit, or at least there's going to be more pressure on partners to pay for their share of the protection, for example. So that may be an opportunity for China to allow them a more forward presence within their own geographic area, primarily the Pacific.
Trump has often called the Chinese leader Xi Jinping a very good friend, but also has described him as dangerous. A new showdown between the US and China could yield grim consequences not only for both nations, but for the entire world.
So should the U.S.-China relationship become more adversarial, would there be a winner? Or could we all pay the price for the derailment of what is arguably the world's most important trade partnership? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from Beijing, Chinese affairs analyst Einar Tangen, from Ann Arbor, Michigan, former State Department senior official in the Obama administration, Stacey, and from Washington, former U.S. diplomat and head of global risk and intelligence at Control Risks, Mr. Dane Chamorro. Thanks all so much for being with me. Dane, I'm going to begin with you. And let's just look at Trump's, basic logic here. Increase tariffs on China, boost U.S. productivity, replace Chinese goods with American-made products, and, create jobs. Pretty simple logic, but can it work? Can the U.S. simply bring manufacturing and those jobs back?
Simplistic way to look at things, and we saw that in the first administration. And what happened as a result was you might have had some movement on the margins in terms of what people sometimes call reshoring of certain processes to the United States. But for the most part, those processes shifted to third countries. So places like Mexico and Vietnam and Malaysia and Hungary have done very well out of the reshoring. And if you look at what happened with the U.S.-China trade, the U.S. direct imports from China dropped, but the imports from those intermediary countries, those connector economies, sometimes we call them, increased by exactly the same amount. So it did shift around. And yes, you can probably find anecdotes where some actually came back to the United States, but for the most part, it went to third countries. And so China is simply exporting intermediary products to those countries, and those products are being assembled in those countries and then exported to the United States.
Okay, so one's loss is another's gain. But Stacey, have Americans been winning?
Well, I'm not sure if that's the right frame to think about this in terms of, well, there are security aspects, obviously, that are connected to all of this, and we should probably speak about some of those as well. The biggest risk is the wild card that incoming President Trump is effectively, and where he will take things. He was all over the map last time he was in power vis-a-vis the China relationship. He's likely to be again, but whether it's economic trade issues or security issues, it's probably wise for President Xi to effectively placate him and work on sort of scoring an early diplomatic kind of engagement bonus by, sort of reaching out for an early conversation with incoming President Trump and seeing, allowing them to feel each other out on both sides of the aisle here in terms of the relationship and plan to meet. That would get things started, because it's really a question now. Obviously, I think the way you frame it is in relation to the election outcome here and how voters really are looking for even more protection. And that will be a temptation for Trump. He's got a lot of hawks in terms of the economic side of the aisle that will likely be in his administration.
Okay, well, let me ask Einar if you think what Jeffrey is suggesting could be a good strategy to have President Xi kind of placate President-elect Trump proactively.
Yeah, I did disagrei with that completely. The idea that you give in to a bully only encourages them. I think you have to have strategic patience, and that's what Beijing has adopted. They know pretty much what's coming down the line. Trump believes that the tariffs combined with devaluing the U.S. dollar will make the U.S. economy competitive as a manufacturing zone. I think most people would doubt that. And China is not threatened by it. The issue is the unpredictability right now. He's said that he wants to put in 60% tariffs against China, 10% against the world, and maybe more. I mean, he said 200%, 100% against cars from Europe and things like this. So you don't really know where he's going to come, whether he's going to come in on day one and slap 60% on, or say he's going to phase it in. But I do agree with this idea that Trump is very susceptible to flattery. He's still that young man who was, coming from New Jersey going into Manhattan in a limousine, trying to join the in crowd. And he very much wants to be considered a heavyweight, to be the equal of Putin and Xi, to the extent that they're willing to, have him there and make much of him. I think that does help. But he's absolutely committed to, his course of action, and he's not going to be stopped. There are no safety valves on him at this juncture. He has the House. Probably has the House, the Senate, and of course the Supreme Court and the presidency. Yeah. So he's going to go forward with what he thinks he has. If you really have any doubts about where he's going, read the 2023 book by Robert Lighthizer, who has been changing the Republican Party into this kind of, we are going to bring everything back to the U.S. by hook or by crook. Just doesn't seem to pencil out.
But Einar, talk to me, though, quickly, if you can, about China itself and its economy and what the repercussions could be. Because China's economy is, by many accounts, it's flailing right now. It's not at its best, if we can put it that way. And 60% tariffs on its exports, when the U.S. is still technically its biggest customer, can't do China any good. No. So, yeah, what are the global repercussions for a failing Chinese economy? How much does everyone have to pay the price, if at all, for that?
Okay, so Andrea, I'm going to reject your characterization. China's not a failing economy. It's going to grow around 5% this year. The U.S. represents about 3% of China's GDP in terms of its trade, but it's actually the third largest trading partner for China. ASEAN is growing at double-digit percentage on there, and Europe is still a factor. In fact, the U.S. deficit with China actually increased. The issue here is that the U.S. consumes more than it produces. It doesn't buy it from China, it buys it from somewhere else, and Chinese intermediate goods find their way to those markets, as the first presenter indicated.
Okay. Just, to throw this out there, Einar, and Dane, I'm going to come back to you, but I mean, many say, yes, you say China is growing at 5%. That could be true, but many economists will tell you China's economy kind of has to run just to stand still. We can talk about that a little bit more in a second, but let me come back to Dane. Dane, tell us, so on the flip side of this, what American consumers really want. Are they prepared for what could be, again, the repercussions for these kinds of tariffs, and are they prepared to pay more for things that they've been accustomed to getting, cheaply?
The American consumer has become hooked on cheap products from China, right? And in the past, that came directly from China, as we were saying before. And now quite often it comes from an intermediary country, whether it's Mexico or Vietnam or somewhere else. So in a way, the benefits have been maintained, even though the label may say a different country. I wanted to pick up on something that Jeff said earlier, which I thought was quite interesting, though, about, we tend to look at these things always from the U.S. perspective and what's happened in the U.S. and what's happened in the U.S. political landscape. It's important to remember that this is not 2016. When President Trump first took power. This is not 2016 China, and it's not 2016 United States, right? The relationship has gotten significantly worse, I would argue, since then. As we always say, here, the only thing that both sides of the aisle, both parties can agree on is the fact that China is a competitor, if not an adversary. And so to Einar's point, you find a lot of you do find a lot of push for more actions against China, whether it's in the trade space, whether it's in the security space, whether it's in tech. And so that is very different. The other thing that's different, of course, is that Xi Jinping was just finishing his first term when President Trump became president the first time. Now he's into 3. And China, the system in China, the standing committee, the Politburo, all of these things have changed, of course, a lot since 2016. He has a much firmer control on the apparatus of government than he had then. You're also right, though, to point out that the economy is not doing so well, and actually not doing as well as it had been. That was predicted for a long time. China couldn't keep growing at the rates that it had been. It was not possible. But one of the bright spots in the economy has been trade. not just with the United States, but with the rest of the world. And so if President Trump or his administration were to take very severe actions, and Einar mentioned not just against China, but about, across many countries, there would be an impact on China, whether it's direct or indirect, because China is the largest trading economy in the world. So there would be an impact there, and it is one of the bright spots right now in the Chinese economy. And of course, in the Chinese economy, the United States is not the only country that has problems with Chinese trade. Right, a lot of countries have problems with Chinese dumping, so to speak, particularly things like steel in their markets, because one of the factors of the downturn in the domestic Chinese economy has been, and this is not unique to China, Korea did it in the past and Japan has done it in the past, it's kind of part of the economic model. When you don't have domestic demand, you export. And so they've been pushing out exports, essentially exporting deflation in certain categories, right? So the United States is not the only country that has a trade problem with China.
Jeffrey, let me ask you, though, if, and this maybe should have been, the precursor question here, actually, because Trump has said what he said, but some are questioning if he can really deliver on it and if he's going to want to. Do you think, though, he can backtrack at any point, or has he just made too many promises to do what he's promised to do and take some very dramatic, potentially globally altering steps?
Well, it's hard to take him at his word because he's proposing something so radical, so outsized, that in economic relations, we really haven't seen anything like that before. What we expect is that he'll be talked out of some of this, even though he has the power to do it. I mean, it's within the presidential prerogative, essentially, to do any level of tariffs in any direction without much domestic feedback, let alone opposition from any other branch. So the question really is going to be, what kind of relationship do these two leaders establish with one another? This is what incoming President Trump puts the most stock in. Is he getting along with the other president? And in this case, President Xi's challenge is to get to him and get to him early. There is a potential trade-off. We should talk about the security aspects of this because all economic relations are not happening in a vacuum here. These are infinitely connected up with the strategic side of the equation. And that's where there's a potential trade-off. And that relates to Taiwan on the one hand and tariffs on the other. There is middle ground in terms of any kind of achievement on the Trump side where China might agree to essentially stabilize relations with Taiwan and bring down the temperature and what have you in return for the U.S. doing so on the tariff side.
Yeah.
That's really what's going to start to drive this relationship.
Yeah, you actually jumped ahead of me there, but that's exactly what I wanted to ask about. Jeffrey, I'll let you comment quickly, and then I'd like to move on to Einar, because I'll just ask it in these terms about how insecure or not you think Taiwan should feel right now with Trump's elections, because there is, as you say, the strategic angle to it. Taiwan's probably going to be, in the middle.
Absolutely, they're feeling much less secure. The increase in threats is palpable. And you've got a situation where China is now looking at what is happening in Ukraine in terms of the Western alliance and what Trump will do there. That will signal a great deal. So you've got Taiwan absolutely feeling squeezed and threatened. But it is essentially in a position where President Trump to do something similar to President Biden, and if she angers him, he's likely to have a caustic response, and it will center right on whether the U.S. will come to Taiwan's defense and whether he'll be verbally open about that in a way that President Biden has been.
Okay, Einar, I mean, you've always said China doesn't want conflict, but when you hear that description of how it could potentially escalate quickly because of, just something as basic as Trump's own temperament, what are your concerns going forward?
Well, actually, I'm quite the other way. I mean, when Trump was asked about Taiwan, his response was, if China invades Taiwan, I will put 200% tariffs on them. Well, what does that signify? It means that he's not really interested in a military response, that he'll take an economic response. So I think everyone can breathe a sigh of relief despite the dark clouds being cast by my colleague there. The fact is, Taiwan, even when they have these military exercises on the island itself, people just go about their normal business. They've been living underneath, next to the volcano for a long period of time. This idea that they're all sitting in their homes, frightened, clinging and hoping the U.S. will come and save them is nonsense. It has nothing to do with the reality in
That's
Taiwan.
an exaggeration.
But well, yeah, it's the way you made it sound as if they're frightened and they're that is nonsense.
Strategically, not people.
I don't know why
homes.
you would even engage in something like that. So let's get to the heart of this. Taiwan isn't the issue. Taiwan is, and everything else in terms of, foreign policy are simply pegs or checkers, or you want to call it pieces on the game board. Donald Trump is interested in economics. He wants to use all of these things as leverage in order to get what he thinks is going to be a stronger America. And that's the way he's going to play it. That's the way he's played it in business, and that's the way he's going to play it now. It's just he's going to be unfettered. I do agree that there's a question of when he comes in, how many tariffs he puts in. Does he phase them in, starting with 5% for everybody and then 10% in a year? How does he do that? If he does it all at once, the shock would literally kill a large part of the American population who are already suffering. Over 70% of the people before the election said they were living paycheck to paycheck. Imagine if you suffered another 20% decrease in your spending power. That would be really fatal.
Let me ask Dane about that, though, because, there are many who feel a very dark cloud is kind of hanging over the globe and the global economy right now, not least because if Trump's, dramatic steps towards the global economy do go wrongly, there's a problem here that when economies do go into severe decline, history has shown us that sometimes the way out is a war economy. And when there are these triggers, for something like Taiwan, that could be the way that, we could see the world, pull itself out of a slump if you're looking at, as I said, historic cycles before. And we have to admit that there has been, you can call it extreme, but there has been talk of a third world war actually somewhere, in our future. So what concerns you there in seeing that if you take these risks with the economies and they plunge deeper into economic crisis, what's the end game?
Well, I think Einar was right in that, President Trump, since his first administration, has been, and pretty consistently, had this message that, I won't get you into war. There was no war when I was, president the first time. I'm not a conflict-driven, leader, et cetera, et cetera. He is very much driven by economics, as he said. I think while he will be unfettered in terms of party control, I think one of the things that will be interesting to watch is, we know a couple of things. First is that he is very much driven by sentiment that is visible, particularly in markets, right? So when the markets go up, he sees that as a sign of success. In the case of a conflict, markets would not go up. He also, it'd be very interesting to see, as with any new leader, who he puts in key positions in his cabinet. And I think that's going to be the next thing. The thing that everybody is watching now is, who's going to choose for Secretary of the Treasury and State and Defense and all these key roles, and what kind of part of the establishment will they come from? Are they going to come from kind of the America First establishment, kind of the J.D. Vance school? Are they going to come from more traditional Republican viewpoints, such as Steve Mnuchin, who was his first Secretary of the Treasury? And so I think those are going to be some key appointments to watch to see who could actually influence his decisions kind of on a day-by-day basis. The old joke in the first term was, who's the most powerful person in Washington? Donald Trump in his first presidency. Who's the second most powerful person in Washington? The person who last spoke to Donald Trump, right? Because he follows very much those key people around him. So I think that's really the next thing to watch, is who he puts in those key roles, and that will give you some idea of the direction.
Jeffrey, is that what you're watching for as well? I mean, will that determine where all of this might be going?
To a degree, yes, but what's going to happen is that China and others are going to test the incoming president, and they're going to test him not so much economically, but on the security side. And so, as much as we think that, oh, Donald Trump is a transactional president and he really doesn't want war, in fact, he had a general in Iran assassinated, targeted. And when he's tested, that's when the strongman tendency for him on the military side, that impulse will be hard for him to resist. And so effectively, we are going to see the security side come to the fore sooner than most think. And the erratic aspect of incoming President Trump is the biggest factor. So it's a bit naive to think that everything is calm and we should just, focus on economic relations, and that's how this incoming president is oriented. He is all over the place, as Dane was just alluding to, and we're likely to see the real test come on the security side, and then we're going to have to hope that it'll be people like Robert O'Brien instead of a Rick Grinnell and others that are close to him when those questions are asked and decisions need to be made.
Jeffrey, I'm going to have to cut you off there and apologize to Einar that I can't give you a final word because unfortunately we're completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. But I'd like to thank all three of you sincerely so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.